Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to the DME for Peace community wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this week's edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. These M&E Thursday Talk webinars on DME for Peace are made possible with the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. Just a note, thank you to everyone who attended last night's final event for the Peace Building Evaluation Consortium. We really appreciate your support over the last few years, and we've loved working with you all. My name is Jack Farrell, and I am the DME for Peace Project Manager at Search for Common Ground, based in Washington, D.C. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Linda Stern of the National Democratic Institute to lead a discussion on community-based participatory, I think I have a frog in my mouth, participatory research with marginalized communities. Just a note to everyone on the line, if you have any questions during the webinar, you can write it in the question function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and we will address it once we reach the question and answer section. I'm now going to hand over to today's guest. Linda, you are very welcome to the Thursday Talks, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Jack. So as Jack said, today we'll be talking about community-based participatory research, or CBPR, with marginalized communities. And the agenda is first to define what CBPR is and give you a little bit of background on CBPR, identify some of the core principles of CBPR, and then the majority of the talk will be to share an example of how NDI tried to use CBPR in a retrospective evaluation of its 10-year program working with Roma partners in the political arena. Then I'll briefly share what I think are some of the benefits and challenges of CBPR from our experience, and we'll open it up for discussion with some key discussion questions. So with that, let me just give you a little bit of background about NDI. We work in democracy assistance, in many aspects of democracy assistance, in election monitoring, governance, political parties, candidate debates, citizen participation, gender, women, and democracy and technology, with the idea of supporting and strengthening the democratic system by strengthening social accountability, political and economic accountability, and government accountability. Excuse me. So jumping into the definition for community-based participatory research, I like to start with a definition from the Kellogg Foundation because it's nice and concise. CBPR is a collaborative approach to research that equitably involves all partners in the research process and recognizes the unique strengths that each brings to the research. And it begins with a research topic of importance to the community itself, with the aim of combining knowledge and action for social change to improve community health outcomes and eliminate health disparities. And the definition references health because CBPR really, most of the work in CBPR has been done in the health sector. However, I think the model has a lot of applications for other sectors, and that's why we at NDI took it up for this evaluation. So just to give you a little bit of background on CBPR, CBPR, I think, has many contributors, but I think it's recognized that Paulo Freire, sort of the father or grandfather of participatory education, development, and evaluation, has contributed foundational concepts to CBPR. So if you're not familiar with Freire's work, he was an anthropologist and educator who lived under the Brazilian military dictatorship between 1964 and 79. And he wrote a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And there he looked at the education system under the dictatorship. And he observed that what was being used was really a banking model for education, where knowledge was seen as capital and the teacher holds all knowledge, and the students are merely empty vessels or little piggy banks waiting to be filled. And so under this banking model for education, the value is defined by the teacher, who's a proxy of the state. And this really reflects authoritarian institutions under a dictatorship, where schools are used to indoctrinate obedient, unquestioning citizens. And so Freire, as an anthropologist, recognized that human beings are not piggy banks and knowledge is not a transaction. Rather, human beings are social animals, and knowledge is generated through our interaction with the world and our dialogue about the world with each other. And so Freire proposed a different model for what he called popular education or critical pedagogy that included having groups of students reflect and act around the issues that they were learning. And this reflection and action process was coined as praxis, where the educator or the facilitator or the evaluator provides input to the students or the participants in the form of posing a question or a problem and providing a framework for analysis. But it's the group that reflects on the problem, looks at ways to solve the problem, and takes action in the world. And so this praxis of reflection, planning, and action in the world is iterative, and over time it raises awareness and critical consciousness among the participants. It also builds the group's capacity to reflect and act together. And Freire posited that this led to empowerment of the people engaged in praxis. And so this very much contributes to the principles of participatory evaluation, where the evaluation is inclusive of those closest to the issue under evaluation. It uses user-appropriate instruments that promote this group deliberation or dialogue, critical dialogue. Participants generate data in real time, and participants analyze and co-construct knowledge about the data. So I think in terms of community-based participatory research, it really sits along a continuum of participatory evaluation, where on one side of the continuum, you may see evaluations that use discrete participatory methods, and on the other side of the continuum, you see fully participatory evaluation designs. And so you will situate community-based participatory research on the far end of the continuum, with the difference being that participation in and of itself does not lead to empowerment. Many evaluations that use participation as discrete methods are using them for instrumental purposes to improve the quality of the evaluation or to gain the perspective or buy-in from participants. But community-based participatory research, which is fully participatory, aims at being transformative. So the quality of the evaluation is important, but so is the capacity building and empowerment of the people involved in the evaluation itself. And so that brings us to the core elements of CBPR. In CBPR, the community is the unit of identity. It is participatory in a voluntary fashion. It is cooperative, so there's a joint contribution between the community and the researcher. And there's shared leadership between the community and the researcher on the evaluation. And that there's co-learning between researchers and community members, and an iterative capacity building at multiple levels. And that there's a balance between research and action. So with that explanation, let me share with you an example of CBPR that NDI used for its 10 years of working with Roma in Eastern Europe and specifically in Slovakia. So just to give you a bit of background, Um, Historically, Roma have been disenfranchised um, before communism, during communism, but in the transition to democracy and a market-led economy, we really saw an accelerated process of disenfranchisement where Roma were increasingly living in extreme poverty and segregation, social segregation, physical segregation, and economic segregation from the larger society. And they also faced endemic and structural racism, and they still face that. And many of their communities are characterized by low educational attainment and weak civic and political awareness, at least at the beginning of the transition, and a lack of political unity. So our program in Slovakia was a political mainstreaming program for Roma built around this theory of change or this framework on voice, space, and accountability. So the idea or our sort of working theory of change was that if Roma have a network of like-minded political activists at different levels within their country and across borders, then Roma capacity for political engagement would be expanded and sustained. If they were trained to run for and hold elected office, they would more effectively discern and represent the interests of their communities in the political process. And if Roma were integrated into government and political institutions, then Roma would use the political processes to address critical issues facing their communities. And if Roma engaged in issue-based advocacy and promoted civic activism, then Roma would effectively hold accountable their elected officials and government institutions. And so, of course, as evaluators, we had lots of questions around these critical assumptions. But because we were working in political participation, we thought it would be important in the evaluation not to simply evaluate the program, but to engage our Roma partners as analytical partners in the evaluation of our 10-year program. So we began with a scoping study using participatory analysis sessions with different Roma stakeholders across the country. And these included Roma activists, politicians, and elected officials, many of whom worked with us over the 10-year period. And along with scoping the issues, we also asked them what their potential evaluation questions were. And based on that scoping study, we decided to use a community-based participatory research model. And so the CBPR model is the same as any research model, where you may begin with key stakeholders and define the purpose of the evaluation, generate key evaluation questions. But the key is that you start with a core group of stakeholders to work with you to do these things. And at key moments throughout the evaluation cycle or the research cycle, you expand the engagement of the community members. And this is that idea of praxis, of building the capacity of a group to iteratively reflect and act together. So again, the research is important, but the process of building praxis and empowering the participants is equally important. And you'll see how that plays out. So in terms of our first three steps, identifying key stakeholders, creating a shared definition of the purpose of the evaluation, key evaluation questions, and collaboratively designing the research and its methods, we identified a core group of stakeholders from the scoping study and formed a Roma advisory committee. And there we shared the scoping findings with them. We oriented them to the participatory evaluation cycle, voice-based accountability framework that our program was using, and the CBPR methods. And we also discussed how we might select communities to participate in the CBPR research cycle and identify Roma research assistants. So after a lot of discussion, we decided that really what we wanted to do was test our critical assumptions about voice, space, and accountability at the local level under the theme of the use of public resources or the misuse of public resources for marginalized Roma communities. So our overarching question was, to what degree does change in Roma political voice and space within marginalized Roma communities influence government accountability for the use of public resources? And in this case, the public resources were EU structural funds that had been allocated by the EU to address the severe infrastructural issues and challenges in these marginalized Roma settlements, where there was no electricity, no roads, no running water, no clinics, so they faced a number of challenges, structural challenges that these funds were meant to address. So what we did was we wanted to select a range of communities that fell across two different axes. One was political space and the other was political voice. And so we wanted to identify communities where there had been an increase in political voice, there was an active Roma citizenry, and there had been an expansion of political space for Roma in that they were able to elect local Roma officials. We also wanted to look at communities where there wasn't an active Roma citizenry or elected Roma officials. And we wanted to identify communities where there was increased activity among the Roma citizens, but they had not yet succeeded in electing Roma as local officials, as councilors or as mayors. And then we wanted to look at communities where there wasn't an active Roma citizenry, but that where Roma had succeeded in getting elected into office. And these communities were often characterized by clientelism, patronage. So with that framework, we worked with the advisory committee. We looked at a roster of communities from an atlas of Roma segregated settlements that had been created. And we used the criteria of the number of Roma civic activists and elected Roma over the last 10 years and identified 10 communities in which to do the community-based participatory research. And so we also discussed with the advisory group the potential problems that we might face in using CBPR in Roma communities. And, you know, as you might think, the advisory committee said we would encounter a lot of distrust and suspicion, and that there was a real potential to create conflict if there were a bunch of outsiders entering the community. And so we also brainstormed with them on ways to address these challenges. Having Roma research assistance was certainly part of that, but it was necessary but not sufficient. Simply being Roma or speaking the local language was not enough. You're still an outsider to these communities. So they suggested that we work with Roma mayors and councilors to socialize them to the CBPR and prepare their communities, but also identify community guides that we could work with. And then one of the advisory members was a Roma mayor himself, and so he also suggested piloting CBPR in his community, and then harvesting the lessons learned and amending the process from there. So the next steps were to once we collaboratively developed the research methods, was to hold a joint training in data collection and analysis and collaboratively collect the data. So we expanded the core group, the advisory group, to recruiting Roma research assistants. And here, the advisory committee played a key role. So we recruited potential research assistants, we trained them, and then the advisory committee observed them in terms of not just their technical skills for research, but their cultural sensitivity, their language abilities, their understanding of the issues that Roma face in the more marginalized communities. And then based on the set of criteria that the advisory committee developed, we selected a group of research assistants to go out and do the CBPR. So the next step then was to collaboratively collect the data and engage community members in joint analysis of the data. So here the Roma research assistants went out to the 10 communities and worked with Roma community activists and local Roma elected officials using a number of participatory research methods that answered key questions in the voice-based accountability framework. So one of them, for example, was a transect walk, and many of you may be familiar with this. This is a mapping of the community and a documentation through pictures and narratives on what is going on in the community. So they identified the changes in the community over the last 10 years and identified community assets as well as community needs. And they did this with the community guides. So it's sort of a walking survey. Then they convened meetings with the Roma activists and the Roma elected officials and used a matrix ranking tool to identify the top 3 challenges in holding the municipal government accountable for services and what their preferred solutions to those challenges were. And some of those solutions were internal, things that the community themselves could do, and other solutions were external. And then they also engaged in a timeline of social accountability where they asked participants to identify the opportunities for holding the government accountable over the last 10 years, as well as the risks that they would face in holding the government accountable, and how they leveraged those opportunities and mitigated those risks. And the Roma researchers themselves held these reflection journals or used these reflection journals to observe what was going on in the communities and answer some key questions about the communities, but also about themselves in the process. And then, of course, we collected additional data, key informant interviews, worked with staff, reviewed reports, both internal and external. So that brought us to the 7th and 8th step. So joint interpretation of findings and collaborative development of recommendations for action. And here is where the participatory process was not as strong, and we puzzled over how to do this. So we ended up, the MEL team at NDI ended up managing the data, analyzing it and visualizing it through the process of triangulation. So corroborating and verifying what the data were saying by making comparisons across different methods, different researchers, and different data sets. And then we looked for ways to visualize and package the data so that participants could engage more fully in the interpretation. And then we went back and held data interpretation sessions using an audience response system. So we engaged members of the community, as well as the advisory committee and the research assistants, giving them these audience response system mechanisms. We'd present the data, or we would pose a question to them about the data and have them register what they thought the data would say, and then showing them the actual data. And that allowed people to engage with the data in an active way, and also break into smaller groups to deliberate on the data and interpret what the data meant in terms of voice space and accountability, and then generate recommendations within that framework, recommendations for voice, space, and accountability. So just to very quickly go over the findings, in terms of citizen voice and social accountability, early in the program, the first 5 or 6 years of the program, we did find an enabling environment for citizen voice because of the EU accession process. So Roma citizens were able to engage effectively in policy discussions and advocacy and aggregating the concerns of their communities. However, midway through the decade, we found that the environment became rather disabling, that with EU accession, there was a focus on human rights, political rights, civil rights. However, the second half of the decade, there was more of an emphasis on integrating Roma into their nations of origin. And this was in part a response to the migration of Roma out to other EU countries. And so the emphasis was on addressing the infrastructural issues that plagued the Roma, but it de-emphasized civil, political, and human rights. And so what we found was that the political will that was generated under the EU accession process was somewhat replaced by some perverse incentives for many different non-Roma stakeholders to capture these EU funds and use them for their own purposes. And we also found that rising nationalism across Europe, and particularly within Slovakia, really thwarted Roma political voice. And in the area of electoral and political accountability, we found that Roma politicians did indeed increase their legitimacy, especially at the local level. They won an increasing number of elected offices as councillors and as mayors, and they even succeeded in electing the first Roma parliamentarian. However, we also found that political parties continued to treat them very tokenistically. So we had these highly professional politicians now who were professional candidates winning office, but the political parties still treated them in a very tokenistic way, simply putting them on the party list in order to gain Roma votes, without really investing in recruiting Roma to the political party or creating pro-Roma policy platforms. And the political economy that was created from the nationalistic rhetoric that was happening in the broader context meant that political parties found it politically costly to publicly advocate or step to the side of the Roma. In fact, it was politically advantageous to vilify the Roma. And so at the local level, we saw a lot of vote buying and intimidation during elections, and the state actively undermining Roma legitimacy in the elections, accusing them of fraud, etc. And then in terms of government accountability, we found little horizontal accountability for the impact of EU funds. So the EU funds were allocated to Slovakia for the municipalities to address Roma concerns, but they were used for things like parks and community beautification projects. And that was largely because the EU was tracking how money was spent, but not whether or not it had an impact on Roma communities. And then the local Roma officials had very little power to sanction the municipal government. So in terms of recommendations out of the CBPR, the overall recommendation was to strengthen Roma's ability to reward and sanction their representatives within the political system. So in terms of social accountability, the recommendation was to horizontally connect and vertically integrate Roma priorities, community priorities, and then to aggregate those community priorities and advocate for local concerns at the national and international levels in terms of policy. And they also recommended that we use ICT for advocacy campaigns to counter extremist narratives. In terms of electoral and political accountability, they recommended that we integrate ICT into voter education and election monitoring to counter vote buying, and to continue to horizontally network Roma mayors and counselors to kind of consolidate their political power, and then vertically integrate those networks into a regional and national conference of Roma mayors that could reward and sanction political parties, political candidates, certain policies, government agencies, etc. And then in terms of government accountability, they recommended that we strengthen and expand the governance component of NDI's program around anti-corruption and transparency. So all of those findings and recommendations were integrated into a dissemination strategy that we shared in community meetings with civil society organizations, NGOs, with academics, and also we worked with the Roma media to disseminate the findings and recommendations. And lastly, my colleague in Slovakia, who is also an anthropologist, is working on a co-publication with Roma research participants for an edited journal in Roma Studies that talks about the process and the value of CBPR for marginalized communities. So that brings us to our last step, which is follow-on action, mobilizing community for action. And so for NDI, we created a follow-on program as a result of this CBPR evaluation that we call Active Roma Community Power to Effect Change, that uses CBPR in community-based advocacy. So just to quickly go over the general benefits and challenges of CBPR, I think we found that, the benefit certainly is that it builds capacity, agency, ownership, and commitment at multiple levels. But it's very time and labor intensive, not just for the researchers, but it can also put additional burden on those least able to engage, the most marginalized. So they have very little time to engage because they're trying to survive. It does promote power sharing and leadership between researchers and the community, but there is a selection bias to participation. It builds solidarity and strengthens community relationships, but there's often unseen or unrecognized heterogeneity and conflict within marginalized communities that you need to be aware of and can become challenging if you're not. It generates recommendations for action based on community context, but there is a tension between research rigor and action. And there's also a tension in terms of the rigor of the findings being suspect by the majority. So the Roma participants told us that, even though we know that we went through a very structured, rigorous process to collect and analyze and interpret the data, that the majority population is not going to believe that Roma had the capacity to do this. So the findings will be suspect by the majority. So that's an additional challenge. And also with donors, the emphasis in terms of evidence-based policy is largely on quantitative, experimental, and quasi-experimental designs. And so there's a trade-off between rigor and the other benefits of CBPR. And then lastly, it does provide a model for community-based advocacy programs. But the challenge is that if you don't have follow-on programming, the sustainability of the process and the outcomes may pose a challenge. And then there are additional challenges of the ethics around the ownership of the research and publications. So with that, I will stop and just to pose a couple of discussion questions. Recently, there was an experimental design done on a participatory action research project by Ryan Sheely from Harvard, and he cautioned, the article cautioned us to be judicious in our claims about empowerment around participatory action research. So he did find that there was an increased sense of agency and empowerment at the individual level, but that there was mixed results in terms of collective action. And it wasn't at all clear that the participatory action research that he studied led to accountability. So I thought that I could stop and open it up for discussion here.
Great. Thank you very much, Linda. Thank you for the detailed presentation. And just a reminder, today's presentation is being recorded. So if there's any information on the slides that you missed, please feel free to revisit that recording on DME for Peace. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks. You can submit a question in one of two ways. The first is through the question function on GoToWebinar, where you can type your question. The second is to click on the hand icon on your GoToWebinar dashboard, which will allow us to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question live. When you do submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. And as again, these talks are recorded and posted on DME for Peace Media Gallery. So a couple of questions have already come in, Linda. I also noticed that we have a couple of raised hands as well. But the first question comes from Bill Kaplan. And Bill writes, I'm having a challenge getting even the idea of a participatory evaluation off the ground and increase involvement. Did you see this in your project? What happened? And how did you address this dynamic to get your project off the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think, intrinsic to this program was participation. So for the program staff, it wasn't a hard sell. We did have to socialize the donor, in this case, the National Democratic Institute, to this idea of participatory evaluation. And that took a bit of time. And, that's part of your stakeholder analysis to do in the very beginning, to figure out what the interests are and what their incentives are or their disincentives. And in this case, the NED was amenable, but it was after a lot of discussion of what this would look like. And I think the other piece was helping the donor understand that this wasn't a traditional evaluation where you go out, collect data, analyze it, and come back with the findings. And I think we had to continue to go back to the donor, and this was an 18-month process. It was really a program in and of itself. We had to remind the donor and even the staff that this is an iterative process that requires time and deliberation, and so we can't quickly synthesize the findings from our perspective, because that would really violate the whole spirit of this. So I think, starting with a stakeholder analysis and really identifying where the incentives are and interests, and then trying to address those is one approach that we used.
Great, thank you, Linda. We have a raised hand from Nicholas Demeter. Nicholas, I'm going to unmute your microphone. Please feel free to ask your question live.
Okay, hey, thanks, Linda, for a great presentation. I was involved with one of the early NDI Roma programs. My question is very quick. You mentioned you use a technology for measuring the feedback when the participants weren't as participative. Did you use something technological like a dial system, or was it just something you worked into the facilitation?
No, it was technology. It was an audience response system. It's rather antiquated, so now you can do it online. But we just had these little handheld mechanisms that was connected to the PowerPoint, and they just it came up on the screen, and they had a number of options, and they pushed A, B, or C, and then it immediately calculated it. So it was, yes, we did use technology, but kind of clunky technology.
Great. Thank you, Nicholas, for asking your question live, and thank you, Linda, for your answer. The next question comes from Claudia Chambers, who writes, how familiar would you say the study population was with the community-based participatory research beforehand? If they were not, could that have influenced how strengthened they became via this process? So I think that raises an interesting point, is what work did you do with this community beforehand?
Hmm. Well, there were 10 communities. So again, this was an iterative process, and starting with the advisory committee. And so we spent a lot of time going over this, what this would look like, what the challenges were. So a lot of deliberation with them. With the Roma research assistants, they were really dubious about the efficacy of this. And so we spent a lot of time training them in how to do this. And we also accompanied them in to some of the communities, piloted this at the community level. And I think as they actually utilized these methods, they saw the value of it. With the communities themselves, as I said, some of the communities we had been working with, or we had been working with some of the elected officials or the civil society organizations. But we didn't, we socialized them to the CBPR process in terms of meeting with the mayors and the local councilors, talking to them about what this process looked like. But in the actual forums, participatory analysis forums, we didn't do any preliminary work with the participants, and there were challenges. But interestingly, uh, many of both these civil society organizations and many of the elected officials really appreciated the participatory tools, because historically the engagement between citizens and elected officials in Roma communities has been very bumpy and contentious, because people often don't have the tools for these kind of constructive engagement and disagreement. And so these tools actually provided a way to engage more effectively. And in the follow-up, many of the elected officials asked us for these tools, to share these tools with them, because they wanted to continue using them to engage their constituents. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think you did a pretty great job there, Linda. The next question comes from Cecilia Dem, who writes, what is the added value of this evaluation to the already existing knowledge related to Roma issues? Is there any relevant change that you expect after this evaluation? On something that organizations who work with Roma, did you learn something that organizations who work with Roma issues should do differently?
Mm. Well, yeah, that's a good question. You know, certainly there's a lot of knowledge out there. This did not, I don't think, discover anything new. I think for the evaluation, it allowed us to look at more at a granular level what was happening in the local communities. So we had these objectives, but there were things going on in the local communities, dynamics that thwarted the effectiveness of our programs. And so for us, it helped us to see some of these dynamics within the system and how to amend our program to more effectively address those dynamics. And as I said, it resulted in a program that explicitly integrates CBPR into our approach. I think the added value, as I said, is the engagement with the community. It's not simply instrumental. It's not simply to get better information or data. It's also to help engage Roma as analytical partners in the process as well. But yes, certainly, you know, I don't think that we had any big ahas that haven't been identified by people who work very closely with the Roma communities, including our staff who have been working with Roma communities for now more than 15 years.
Great, thank you, Linda. And we're just going to squeeze in one last question before we wrap up today. And this comes from Laura Livingston. And Laura writes, you mentioned that Roma participants were concerned that the results will be met with skepticism by broader society. Did you encounter this kind of skepticism? And if so, how did you navigate it?
I mean, I don't know that we did navigate it very well. I think that our dissemination strategy was probably not as strong as it could be. It was at the community level. We did engage with kind of allies and also through the Roma media. But I don't think that we did effectively navigate the skepticism among the majority population very well. I think that's an area where we'd want to improve if we were to do this again. But it does bring up this whole issue of, you know, the trade-off between rigor and participation. I think I came away with this feeling like, you know, even though there were benefits of this participatory process, I did feel like we could have strengthened the advocacy case with stronger external data, quantitative data, because that is the language that is spoken in policy and in the donor community. So I don't know that we effectively navigated it.
Great, thank you, Linda, and thank you everyone for your questions. Unfortunately, we don't have time to get to them all, but I encourage you to return to the recording on the Deeming for Peace Media Gallery and continue this discussion online for the world to see. Thank you, Linda, for an amazing presentation, and thank you everyone for joining this edition of the M&E Thursday Talks. We're going to be back in 2 weeks' time with members of the Dharma platform who are going to lead a discussion on real-time data from the front lines, humanitarian uses of new technology. It's a discussion I'm really excited to facilitate. And just a note for the 100+ people that are still online today, you can host a Thursday Talk yourself. If you go to your chat function right now, there is a form to apply to host the M&E Thursday Talks. Is there something your organization is working on that's particularly interesting? Is there an evaluation that you want to showcase? Get in touch. We'd love to have that discussion. Yeah. Thank you, Linda, again. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your week, and we will see you online in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you, Jack. Thanks, everyone.